Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. This is the winter that Cress is 13 years old. Cress is trying to find out what her trademark will be at school. Will she be a serious, sweet, and unknown person, or should she find a way to be known as that Crazy Cress Delahanty? Then, later in the season, Cress will be performing in a dance recital. But, oh, she is so worried her parents may mispronounce a word, or somehow want to participate in the festivities. What would her friend Bernadine, known as Nedra on Fridays, think of her if Mr. and Mrs. Delahanty do something embarrassing? Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Cress Delahanty by Jessamyn West. Chapter 5. 13. Winter, Part 1. Mrs. Delahanty went to the door of Crescent's room to remind her that it was time to set the table for supper. It was a fine Saturday afternoon in November, and ordinarily, Cress would have been outside, up in the hills with friends, or helping her father with the irrigation, or just walking about under the pepper and eucalyptus trees in the yard. Deep in a world which found significance in the parchment-like bark peeled from a eucalyptus tree, or in a bunch of berries. 13 berries, exactly the number of years she had been alive. What was the meaning of that? Dropped from the pepper tree. But this afternoon Cress had spent in her room in spite of the clear, warm weather, and Mrs. Delahanty examined her daughter's stubby, somewhat boyish profile, outlined against the golden light of the west windows, with considerable curiosity. "What are you writing, Cress?" Cress looked up from the sheets of paper spread before her on the drop leaf of the rickety bamboo desk she had bought for herself that summer and said, "I'm not exactly writing, Mother." The sheets had words on them, and Cress had a pencil in her hand. "I'm making a list," she added. At this, Mrs. Delahanty smiled. In school, she had learned that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and while she had always been somewhat hazy as to the meaning of that sentence, still it had stayed in her memory, and was, amended, her formula for accounting for her daughter. Cress recapitulates John. Since she loved and approved her husband, believing him to be not only handsome but as often as not wise and sensible as well, she was glad this was so. Yet it was strange, as now, to see the gestures and habits of a large, dark, 38-year-old rancher recapitulated in a medium-sized, tow-headed girl. How much simpler my life would have been, she thought, easing her shoulders against the door jamb, if Cress had recapitulated me instead of John. John was hard enough to fathom in himself and writ large, without the added need of fathoming a John writ small, condensed, and made more obscure in a daughter. Nor was she helped any in understanding Cress's activity by the fact that it was one she had witnessed in John for 15 years. More than 15 years. She had once broken her engagement for 2 days because of a list John had made. John had shown her one evening, with considerable pride, she now realized, a sheet of paper headed in a businesslike way, "Reasons for Loving Gertrude Amboy," a sheet Mrs. Delahanty still remembered with resentment. On it, John had analyzed his emotions and her attributes, as if both were subjects suitable for the biology textbook in which she had learned about recapitulation. He had started out with 1. Character, and wound up with 5. Physical beauty, and he had pursued all headings not only under A's, B's, and C's, but even unto small ones, 2s and 3s. It still made her angry, and at the time she had believed it would be impossible to live with a man capable of dissecting his love in so orderly a fashion. She had thrown his reasons for loving Gertrude Amboy down on the floor and stomped on it, treading with particular energy on the section headed 1. Character. A. Social. 1. Calm. "You haven't an ounce of romance in your makeup, John Delahanty," she was afraid now, yelled. "Gertrude," John had replied, "you know that isn't true." She had, too, but she had been really hurt, and she had turned her back on him, though this had been hard to accomplish, standing as she was with his arms about her, and had sobbed 2 or 3 times. "I should think you would be glad to know you were marrying a man of reason," John had defended himself. She had not said so then, but she thought then, as now, that there was probably very little connection between reason and list-making. List-making, she felt sure, was just a way some people had of being orderly about their unreason. What she had said then was, a man who could make a list of reasons for loving anyone could make a list for not loving them. Could, and would, John had acknowledged cheerfully, as though the fact were not damaging. He had held her momentarily far enough away from him to be able to get into his coat pocket. "Look at this," he had said, holding a second sheet across her shoulder. It was headed, "Reasons for not loving Gertrude Amboy," and except for 1, none, A, none, small 1, none, the sheet was completely empty. Although this, in theory, was just as offensive as the first list, she had not felt quite the same way about it, had in fact been unable to resist kissing John back when he had kissed her, but it had taken her 2 long miserable days of non-engagement to accommodate herself to the idea of spending a lifetime with a list-maker, and to re-engage herself to John. And little did I know then, she thought, that what I was really going to have to accommodate myself to was a lifetime with 2 list-makers. "What are you making a list of, Cress?" she asked. She had no fear that she was intruding in private matters. One of John's greatest pleasures was the sharing of his lists. After 2 or 3 evenings hunched over catalogues and sheets of paper, he would look up about bedtime and say, "See what you think of this, Gertrude," and begin to read from a list headed, "Supplies needed for a prolonged trip in sub-zero weather," or perhaps something more simple as, "The well-stocked cellarette," or "Minimum essentials for a basic library on citriculture." They had neither cellar nor cellarette. They lived in Southern California, where 0, let alone sub-zero temperatures were never known, and the essentials of citriculture were all packed away in John's head, without need of any library, basic or otherwise. Cress looked up from her list and answered, "I'm making a list of traits, Mother." "Traits?" Mrs. Delahanty asked. "Good and bad traits," Cress said, and then further explained. "For school, that is." "You mean personal traits?" Mrs. Delahanty asked. "Kind of," Cress replied. Mrs. Delahanty wondered anew. She had never in her life made a list of any kind except a grocery list, and this only when pushed into it by John. Life was bigger and better, too, she thought, than words, and it was disappointing and restricting to see a picnic summed up in "Remember citronella, Kleenex, Band-Aids," or a trip to the city drained of half its promise by a list headed "Articles needed en route." There were clearly 2 classes of people in the world, those for whom the world was magnified and enriched in words, and those who could never find the beautiful world of their living and knowing on any sheet of paper. John and Cress belonged to the first class, and she, belonging to the second, could only stand apart, as she did now, trying to understand the need they had for their journals and records, for their "Yesterday I rose at 6:30," and their "Tomorrow I plan to begin rereading David Copperfield," and their 1s, 2s, and 3s. "Traits like honesty, kindness, cheerfulness?" she asked. "Well, like them," Cress said, "but they aren't on it. This is a list of traits useful for school." "Isn't honesty useful for school?" "Nobody at school I ever heard of was popular for honesty," Cress said. After Mrs. Delahanty had considered this in silence for some seconds, Cress asked, "Did you ever hear anybody say, 'I'm just crazy about her, she's so honest'? Did you?" "No," Mrs. Delahanty admitted. "I guess I never did." "Me either," Cress said. "It's all right to be honest," Cress reassured her, "but there's nothing very outstanding about it." "Oh, I don't know," Mrs. Delahanty said, trying to keep a foothold in this conversation, which she felt to be, in spite of its subject matter, pretty slippery. "Look at Diogenes. We've remembered him all these years." Cress sniffed. He was hunting for an honest man, not being one. And it was his lantern that was outstanding. That was his trademark. That and his barrel. "There have been a lot of people with lanterns and barrels we've forgotten, I expect." Cress agreed. "The trademark's got to stand for something, but if you get a good gag and it stands for something," for all her conviction of tone, Cress looked uncertain, "you're fixed, don't you think?" Before Mrs. Delahanty had answered this, if she could have answered it, Cress asked another question. "Mother, do you think I'm funny?" "Funny?" Mrs. Delahanty repeated. If Cress was in the midst of some schoolgirl gloom because someone had called her funny, she certainly didn't want to add to it. On the other hand, if by funny Cress meant witty, she could not truthfully say she wasn't. "I mean amusing," Cress explained forthrightly. "In your opinion, can I say and do amusing things? Can I make you laugh?" Controlling an inclination to laugh right then, Mrs. Delahanty answered, "Yes, Cress, I think you can be very amusing, and you've made me laugh many a time." "Yesterday," Cress said, "I was told very confidently something Bernadine Devers said. She said, 'That Crescent Delahanty is deliciously amusing.' It wasn't a trade last or anything like that. I didn't promise Hazel a thing in return for the compliment." Mrs. Delahanty said, "I don't know about deliciously, but the rest is true enough." Cress gave her mother a look of awe and unbelieving. "Bernadine Devers," she said. "Why, I didn't suppose she knew I was alive, let alone amusing." "Let alone deliciously," Mrs. Delahanty said. Then, seeing her daughter's expression alter, doubt replacing radiance, she turned to add, "Who is this Bernadine, anyway?" Cress brightened again at once. "Just about the most popular girl in school, that's all. Just about the most outstanding sophomore, anyway." Cress herself was a freshman. "What makes Bernadine so outstanding?" Cress considered for a while. "Well, Bernadine's got practically everything, but her trademark is personality." "Doesn't everyone have personality, even fathers and mothers?" Mrs. Delahanty asked, trying to be a little amusing herself. "Everybody has personality," Cress agreed. "Some people have positive personality, and some people have negative personality." Mrs. Delahanty waited rather self-consciously for a further development of this idea. But Cress was interested only in Bernadine. "But glamorous personality is Bernadine's trademark. How is a person?" Mrs. Delahanty asked with real curiosity. "When a glamorous personality is her trademark?" Mrs. Delahanty had supposed that this question would take some thinking about, but Cress had evidently thought about it before. "When glamorous personality is your trademark, you are a law unto yourself," she answered promptly. Mrs. Delahanty whistled. Whew! Thank goodness your trademark isn't personality. Cress put down her pencil with melancholy finality. At present, she said, I don't have a trademark, not of any kind. That night after supper, Mr. Delahanty, who had been up at 5 irrigating, and who was put out with a climate so tardy with its rains that irrigating this late in November was necessary, said to his wife, I think I'll just stay home and read tonight. I have to reset the water at 10 anyway, and we'd have to rush home. You and Cress go ahead into town if you want to. I don't want to, Cress said. I'm busy. I'm not busy, Mrs. Delahanty admitted, but I'm not enough interested in what happens when a lady mayor meets a male mayor to drive to the movies alone to find out. I can tell you what happens anyway, Mr. Delahanty said. Same thing like when Lady Pearl Diver meets Gentleman Pearl Diver, or Lady Surgeon meets Male Surgeon. Cress listened to this exchange with an unsmiling face, then went to her room, where Mrs. Delahanty heard the lid of the bamboo desk at once creak open. The evening had cooled, and at 8, Mrs. Delahanty lit a fire of eucalyptus chunks, then challenged her husband to a game of Russian bank. Mr. Delahanty accepted the challenge, but he did not care whether he won or lost, and Mrs. Delahanty wished for Cress, who followed the fall of each card with the intensity of a player who has the home ranch up at stake. At 9, Cress came out, advised her father to his benefit on his play, but refused to play herself. No, I just came out because of the fire. I've got work to do, she said, and took her papers to the dining-room table. At 9:30, after losing his second game, Mr. Delahanty said, Anybody want to go out and reset the water for me? When no one answered, he said, Woman's work is from sun to sun, but man's work is never done, and went outside cheerfully whistling Swanee River. Mrs. Delahanty, who knew what he would want when he came back to the house, went to the kitchen and made a pot of chocolate and a plate of toasted cheese sandwiches. Cress wandered out, watched her whip the chocolate to a foam, and put the sandwiches in the oven, refused anything to eat, then picked up a large wedge of cheese, and went off toward her room, nibbling gloomily. Mrs. Delahanty had planned to take the food in by the fire, but Mr. Delahanty said as he pulled off his muddy boots, Let's have it on the dining-room table where there's room to spread out. He carried the tray in himself, and had the chocolate poured by the time Mrs. Delahanty, who had forgotten the napkins, came to the table. What's this? He asked, gesturing with a cheese sandwich toward the sheet of paper beside his chocolate cup. Mrs. Delahanty, who had an idea, answered only, What does it say? Mr. Delahanty read, stared, drank chocolate, and finally said in a voice in which disbelief and sorrowful understanding mingled, It says here, Useful traits for school. 1. Personality. A. Unusual. Small 1. Witty. He put the sheet down. What's the meaning of this? It's a list, Mrs. Delahanty said. You ought to understand if anybody would. Mr. Delahanty ate half a sandwich, then picked up a second sheet. My trademark. Isn't she crazy, is the heading here, he said thoughtfully. Isn't she crazy is in quotes, he explained. Under it is, Useful gags for craziness. 1. Clothes. A. Shoes. Small 1. Unmatched. He put the second sheet face down on the first, and covered both with the sandwich plate. He finished his cheese sandwich, then said, My God, what a dark world. You do understand it, then? Mrs. Delahanty asked. Certainly. I understand it. I lived there for a year. What year? The year I was 13. Mrs. Delahanty had not known her husband until he was 15, and these hints of an earlier life always enthralled her. She saw him at 13, a big solemn boy with soft dark hair inquiring eyes and a sensitive mouth. "You don't know who you are then, or what you can do. You've got to make 100 false starts. You've got to make your mark without knowing what your mark is. Are you a coward or a hero? How do you know without involving yourself in dangerous situations? So you walk ridgepoles and visit cemeteries. How do you know you're alive even at that age if you aren't noticed?" "Dear John," Mrs. Delahanty said. Mr. Delahanty took no notice of this endearment, and Mrs. Delahanty hadn't expected him to. He was wound up now. He was back where he had been at 13. John Delahanty was the center of Mrs. Delahanty's world. To her mind, the light from the fireplace lapped toward him. The rising wind booming in the eucalyptus trees celebrated him. The foothills beyond the orange groves circled around him. John gave her 2 lives. Without him, she would have had only her own life of action, unexamined, not understood. Somebody, John frequently quoted him, had spoken of the tragedy of an unexamined life. That, without John, would have been her life, and she supposed her tragedy. But John, with his eloquent words, yes, they were eloquent, she thought, listening now, revealed to her this richer world of motives, fully understood and rightly apprehended. By relating the joys and sorrows of his own life to the world's joys and sorrows, past and present, he opened to her depths of meaning which she felt her own instinct of living would never have discovered. "It's the dark time of life," Mr. Delahanty said again. "It turns my stomach now. But at 13, I, too, had a trademark." "A trademark?" Mr. Delahanty grimaced. "Spitting. At 13, I was a professional spitter. I used to give exhibitions. Distance and accuracy. Power and control. I had everything. And I hated it. And I still hate anybody now from grammar school days who calls me Spit Delahanty. I don't ever remember seeing you spit. At 15, I was far past that. An ex-spitter. By that time, I had taken up..." He stopped in mid-sentence. "Cress?" he said. Cress, in her pink-sprigged seersucker pajamas, the cheek that had been against the pillow pinker than the other, stood in the opening between living room and dining room. "Did we wake you with our talk?" Cress sat down in the chair her father pushed out for her. "No," she said, "you didn't wake me up because I hadn't gone to sleep yet." Mrs. Delahanty had the feeling that Cress had left her lists out on purpose, had given them time to read them, and would now like to have their opinion of craziness as a trademark. But Mrs. Delahanty was loath to speak of them unless Cress did, and Cress was silent, and John went on, as if he had never heard of trademarks, or craziness, or spitting, for that matter either. "How's school?" Mr. Delahanty asked his daughter. "Classes, teachers, kids, Edwin, Honor Gallagher? Everything turning out as well as you thought it would?" "Everything's all right," Cress said, opening a cheese sandwich, then closing it like a book she didn't care to read. "Did I tell you I'm probably going to be freshman editor of the yearbook?" "No," said Mr. Delahanty. "You didn't. That's fine. Congratulations." "I'm not editor yet," Cress reminded him, "but spoken of for the job. Spoken of favorably for the job." Cress admitted it. "And it's a tradition that the person who's freshman editor is editor-in-chief his senior year." "Congratulations," Mr. Delahanty said again. Then, shaking the chocolate pot, "Have some cocoa? It's soporific. Just what you need to put you to sleep." "I read the other day it wasn't," Cress said. "I read it had every bit as much caffeine in it as coffee." "Where? Where did you read that?" "In the newspaper." "The newspaper!" scoffed Mr. Delahanty. "You can read anything in the newspapers. Let's consult the authority. He sprang from his chair with the enthusiasm which the search for a fact always gave him, and came back to the table, bearing Volume 4 of the Britannica, Bisharan to Calgary. Cress got up and leaned against his shoulder as he flipped the pages. Mrs. Delahanty, while the two of them pursued the word, took the thing itself, caffeine or no caffeine, to the kitchen to reheat for Cress. The campaign, Craziness is a Trademark, seemed to be going well in spite of Mrs. Delahanty's doubts. Cress, as November wore on, had never seemed more happy. Certainly she had never been more active or engrossed, and her activities engaged Mrs. Delahanty's energies as well as her own. "Life now," Mrs. Delahanty reported to her husband one grey day at lunch, "is very full for me. It's like being property manager for a vaudeville star. It takes a good deal of equipment and thought to achieve the effect of craziness, when actually you're as sober as a judge." "Cress isn't and never was as sober as a judge," Mr. Delahanty said. "That Bernadine had something when she said Cress was amusing. Clowning comes naturally to her." "Not this clowning," Mrs. Delahanty said. "She memorizes lines. She gathers up equipment. She teaches kids their cues. It's exactly as spontaneous as a vaudeville act, and I think we should put a stop to it." "How?" Mr. Delahanty asked. "Just tell her it's silly and to stop it. And for the rest of her life she'd blame us for keeping her from finding out who she really was." "Well, there's no use her finding out the hard way, when we could tell her that she suits us just as she is." "Cress is trying out her wings for a little flight from the us nest." "She's trying the wrong wings then, John. Do you know what she did this morning?" Mrs. Delahanty didn't wait for any reply from her husband. "She wore her bedroom slippers to the bus and carried her Oxfords. She had to have new bedroom slippers for this, by the way. The old ones wouldn't do for a public appearance. Do you know what the gag is there?" This time she waited for Mr. Delahanty's answer. "No," he said, "I don't." "The gag is that she has figured that it takes 3 minutes' time to put on her Oxfords. Time on the bus is waste time. So if she puts them on there, that 3 minutes is saved. 3 minutes a day is 15 minutes a week, an hour a month, 9 hours in a school year. The whole busload will have reported it at school 10 minutes after they arrived. Hear the latest about Cress Delahanty, that crazy kid? She's figured out how to save 9 hours a year by putting on her shoes in the bus. What a girl! What a card!" Mrs. Delahanty's imitation of the high school crowd did not awaken her husband from his musing. 9 hours," he murmured thoughtfully. "A whole work-day. I suppose she can sleep that much longer." "John Delahanty," Mrs. Delahanty said, "you surely—" But in the midst of that, she changed her tack. "Did you hear her phoning last night?" "With one ear. I was busy at the time." Yes, he had been. Mrs. Delahanty felt her lips pursing and unpursed them. Working on a 3-sheet list. Articles needed for complete electrification of the Delahanty Ranch. Prices at Monkey Ward, Sears Roebuck, Martin and Dugdale. "It would have paid you to listen." Mr. Delahanty looked up from his Spanish rice. "Why?" he asked. "She makes this call every night. Her algebra teacher made the sad mistake of saying in class that he couldn't possibly rest at night for wondering whether the class had done its homework. So Cress calls him." "What does she say?" "She says," Mrs. Delahanty said crisply, "This is Crescent Delahanty reporting, Mr. Holcomb. I have finished my homework. I hope you will sleep well now." About this exploit, Mrs. Delahanty, feeling that such a lily needed no gilding, made no comment. Mr. Delahanty appeared to choke a little on his Spanish rice. "More red pepper than usual in this today," he said. Mrs. Delahanty said, "I have been making that dish for 17 years, and I put exactly the same amount of red pepper in it now as I did then. Maybe my mouth is just getting more sensitive with the years." "Maybe so," Mrs. Delahanty agreed, "but I doubt it." "I suppose that really was carrying things a little far." Mrs. Delahanty waited for a more adequate summing up of the situation. "I should think Mr. Holcomb would be over any night now to strangle her," Mr. Delahanty said. This seemed quite a lot more likely to Mrs. Delahanty, and she relaxed somewhat, pleased to find that the family still contained 2 sane members. Mr. Delahanty's sudden whoop of laughter, however, dispelled this happy supposition. With that laugh still in her mind's ear, Mrs. Delahanty handed her husband the Tennant highlights at lunch a few days later. "Cress gave this to me this morning before she left for school," she said. "I think maybe she thought we would like some time alone to digest it." The paper was folded to the column called "The Highlights On" by I. Markham. This week's highlight was on Cress Delahanty, that crazy freshman, and there was a drawing of her in the center of the column, in her fur-topped bedroom slippers, holding an Oxford in each hand. "Read it out loud," Mrs. Delahanty said. "I want to be sure I wasn't seeing things when I read it." After some preliminary smoothing and folding, which the highlights didn't need, Mr. Delahanty read in an expressionless voice, "Crazy or cagey, freshman girl's sole discoverer of way never to be on her uppers, and you are a heel if you suggest that this is not the last word on this soulful subject. Personally, the ice-blonde freshman can vamp us any time she wants to." Mr. Delahanty stopped reading. "Gertrude, do you really want me to go on with this?" "Yes," Mrs. Delahanty said, "I do." Mr. Delahanty took up the highlights again, but before continuing, he said, "Ice blonde? Why, Cress is nothing but a mere child." "A color is a color, I suppose," Mrs. Delahanty answered mildly, "regardless of age." "Ice blonde is something more than a color," Mr. Delahanty argued. But when Mrs. Delahanty asked him to explain, he could do no more than mention 2 or 3 movie stars. "Go on reading," Mrs. Delahanty urged. "There's a good deal more." Mr. Delahanty gave the highlights a couple more of the flattening whacks it did not require, and continued, "Personally, the ice-blonde freshman can vamp us any time she wants to. We get a boot out of Delahanty. We pumped Cress, and this is her version of what she calls Delahanty's Law. Or, to add our own interpretation, what you do on the bus doesn't count." Mr. Delahanty paused once more, and Mrs. Delahanty waited expectantly. But about Delahanty's Law and its interpretation, he had nothing to say. "It goes on, Gertrude, as you doubtless remember, this way," he said. "No nitwit she, Cress, and we quote, thus explained her discovery while we listened, tongue hanging out, so to speak, and all unlaced with interest. I, in my tireless search for efficiency, discovered that I spent 15 minutes a week putting on and tying my shoes. Now, if I did this on the bus, time ordinarily lost, as all bus riders know, in useless chatter, I would gain 1 hour a month, or 1 full working day a year." Asked what she intended doing with this saved time, Cress answered demurely, "Study." Asked what, she replied, "Algebra. Mr. Holcomb, you know, can't rest nights if the homework for his class isn't done. See next week's highlights for the Holcomb Delahanty story." Asked what her ultimate goal was, Cress said, "Oxford." "Excuse us, please, now, while we pull down our own congressional gaiters, not on a bus, thus losing, according to Delahanty's Law, 3 minutes. We're going to hot-foot it over to Cress's. Got a little equation we want help with. Delahanty plus I Markham equals ? See next week's column for answers. Mr. Delahanty folded the tenant highlights into a compact oblong and threw it toward the fireplace, which he missed. What have we got for dessert? He asked. It's right there before you, Mrs. Delahanty said, indicating the raisin pie by his plate. Mr. Delahanty grunted and began slowly to eat. Mrs. Delahanty didn't feel like raisin pie herself. John, she asked, what's your opinion of that? My opinion is that I Markham will go far. We'll turn on the radio any day now and hear I Markham's report on the love life of Lana Turner. What do you really think, John? I think it's a pity and a crying shame. You'll speak to Cress, then? It wouldn't do any good. What can we say to her? Stop saying and doing funny things? Yes, we can. Sure we can. But in the first place, we can't stop her, and in the second place, if we could stop her, Cress would only hate us for the rest of her life. I tell you, she's finding out who she is. At that age, the only way to know whether craziness is your trademark is to be crazy. It's something you've got to do. I didn't have to. No, Gertrude, you didn't. This quick admission hurt Mrs. Delahanty. She felt slighted, left out. She was no list maker like John and Cress, but surely she had her share of craziness. They were not the two dark, chaotic ones, were they? Well, she was no more than the dependable housewife of known and small dimensions. Once on a dare, I wore a dress to school hindside foremost. Gertrude, Mr. Delahanty said, you never had to bother trying on attitudes. You were born wearing one that fit beautifully. Still and startled at this sudden turning of the conversation, Mrs. Delahanty watched her husband eat raisin pie. He paused to ask, Don't you want to know its name? Mrs. Delahanty nodded, mutely. Radiant, loving kindness. This unexpected and extravagant compliment made Mrs. Delahanty feel shy. It was too extraordinary for her to deal with instantaneously, and she put it aside for later consideration. Whatever you think about Cress, John, I'm going to speak to her. I think it's my duty, and I'm going to warn her at the first opportune minute. The first opportune minute came that very afternoon, and Cress, after being warned, went in tears to her room. She came out, ate her supper wordlessly, then went again to her room. When Mrs. Delahanty heard the bamboo desk creak down, she said to her husband, There is Cress writing out a list of reasons for hating me. What now? Mr. Delahanty asked, and Mrs. Delahanty, with no heart for dishwashing, said, Come on in by the fire and I'll tell you. Mr. Delahanty settled himself in the Morris chair, which had been his father's, and Mrs. Delahanty stood in front of the fireplace, close to the fire, until her calves began to scorch, then on the edge of the hearth until they cooled. This afternoon, she said, Cress came skipping and hopping home from the bus, clapping those two horrible bedroom slippers together over her head like castanets. Symbols, said Mr. Delahanty. Together, anyway, and happy as a lark. It seems they had an assembly today. Assemblies, said Mr. Delahanty. Bird imitations, football rallies, talent shows. When do the kids go to school? Assemblies, said Mrs. Delahanty, who went to PTA, provide the children opportunities for participation in life situations. Is that thought to be a good thing? A life situation, if you ask me, is just about to engulf Cress. If you ask me, a little participation in something unlifelike on the order of ancient history or the ablative case is what Cress has a crying need for. A little more life participation, and she'll bust apart at the seams. I can hear them. John, Mrs. Delahanty said, I just want to tell you what Cress told me, and what I told her. I don't give a whit one way or another about assemblies. The point is, they had one. And when Mr. Dumont came out on the stage— Who is this Mr. Dumont? A bird imitator? Mr. Dumont is the vice principal in charge of student activities. He has premature gray hair, a beautiful tan, and sings, On the road to Mandalay, so Cress says, you can feel the waves rising and falling beneath you. That's enough about Dumont, Mr. Delahanty said, unless you've got some seasickness pills handy. I've seen him, Mrs. Delahanty said, and he really is nice. He came out on stage, Mr. Delahanty reminded her. He came out onto the stage to give them what Cress called a little pep talk about less lavatory art in the future, please. What? Said Mr. Delahanty in a strong voice. John, please try to listen. I don't know why the school does what it does or why Cress calls things by the names she uses. All I want to do is tell you what happened. Okay, Mr. Delahanty said. I'm listening. Tell me. He had the look of a man who has not yet had his say out. But Mrs. Delahanty went on in spite of it. On his way out, Mr. Dumont stumbled over a pair of tennis shoes somebody had left on the stage. He stooped, picked them up by the strings, swung them back and forth, and then said in what Cress reports as being a perfectly deadpan, side-splitting way, I see Delahanty has been here. Like Kilroy has been here, you know. I know, Mr. Delahanty said. Then, when everybody had stopped laughing at that, he said, They look like my size, but as a student of Delahanty's law, I intend to wait until I'm on a bus to try them on. Mr. Dumont's trademark appears to be craziness, too, Mr. Delahanty remarked. The kids seem to love him. Why not? Asked Mr. Delahanty. The kids are one with Mr. Dumont. I thought you approved of craziness. I thought that was what we'd been arguing about. Gertrude, I haven't been arguing. And what I approve of is not craziness, but freedom to find out who and what you are. Well, Cress thinks she's found out. She thinks she's a wit or a wag or the school jester. She says that about Delahanty's law really panicked them, and that not an eye in the auditorium but was on her, even though she was sitting in an obscure spot under the balcony in the midst of 172 other freshmen and practically invisible. She didn't say anything about standing up or whistling and waving her handkerchief to help them see her, did she? Now, John. Anyway, when she was finished, and I hated to do it because she was as happy as a prima donna, suggested Mr. Delahanty. Oh, no, as a baby who's picked its first flower. Well, when she finished, I told her everything I've been thinking. I told her to stop it at once. That it was cheap and silly to play to the grandstand that way, and that she was going to regret getting a reputation as a harebrained clown, when she was really a good, sweet, solid, sensible child. Mrs. Delahanty was unable to keep her voice from trembling. What did Cress say? She said, good, solid, sensible, sweet, as if I had reviled her. She said, child, as if I had called her a bad name. Then she began to cry. Mr. Delahanty nodded and nodded, as if this were all an old story to him. Then she stopped crying long enough to say that I didn't understand a thing. Not her, not school, not young people in general, not Mr. Dumont, not I. Markham. And she said her constant prayer was that when she grew up and had children, that she would not forget what it was like to be young, the way I have. And she said that for 3 months at school she had been sweet, solid, and sensible. And where had it gotten her? At the end of 3 months of that, she had been a complete non-entity, and not a soul at school could have told you who Crescent Delahanty was. And now, At the end of 3 weeks of planned living, with craziness for her trademark, she is a great success, and she doubts there is even a custodian at school who has not heard of Crescent Delahanty and Delahanty's Law. In fact, I said, you are now a character. She said yes, she was, and proud of it. Then she went to her room, but before she left, she said, anyway, my father understands me. And now she's in there making a list headed, What's Wrong with Mother? But I don't care, I had to tell her. Mr. Delahanty caught at the edge of Mrs. Delahanty's skirt as she switched away from the fire and toward him, and pulled her down onto his lap. Don't try to comfort me, she said, struggling to get up. You think one way and I think another. That's all there is to it. I think just what you think, Gertrude, except that I think Crescent will have to find it out for herself. She'll wake up pretty soon, and it'll be a painful awakening, but it's bound to come. Mrs. Delahanty, in spite of herself, was settling back and relaxing. You believe that? Of course. You don't think our daughter's a fool, do you? No, Mrs. Delahanty said, letting her head finally rest at ease against her husband's shoulder. How could I? Cress recapitulates you. The awakening, as Mr. Delahanty had named it, came the first week in December. The rains, which had held off through the whole of November, arrived the minute the November leaf on the calendar was torn off, and made up by their abundance for their lateness. On Friday afternoon, Mr. Delahanty, happily housebound by the downpour, sat before a drowsy fire, working on his electrification lists. On the other side of the fire, Mrs. Delahanty was shelling English walnuts, preparatory to sugaring them for annual Christmas gifts to Eastern relatives. She listened to the pleasant blend of sounds, fire sighing, pen scratching, nutshells cracking, and behind and giving body to the blend, the fine, heavy sound of the constant rain. She was, she thought, reasonably happy. Then, as the pile of walnut kernels rose in the crock on the floor by her side, she decided that there is no such thing as reasonable happiness, since happiness, like love, is without reason. A reasonable happiness is usually simply all the reasons one can think of for not being unhappy. I'm not unhappy because my family is in good health, and I myself am well, and a good and needed rain is falling, and we have a tight roof over our heads, and the fire is drying beautifully. No, she thought, that is not enough. Happiness, like love, fills the heart and does not need to be accounted for. Joy washes away knowledge of numbers, the ones, twos, and threes. That was why, she supposed, John's lists had offended her. If you could analyze, you were not in love. Or at least, she was not. She was analyzing now. That was the reason she knew she was not happy. And continuing to analyze, she knew she would not be until Cress was herself once again. Cress came in from the bus, as Mrs. Delahanty recognized this fact, but she was neither the old Cress, solid and sensible, nor the new one, crazy and show-off. This Cress had been crying. She had on a hooded raincoat, but she had walked up from the bus with the hood hanging down her shoulders, and her hair, soaked to the scalp, was lank and mousy. She was no ice blonde now. Water dripped from her cheeks and beaded her eyelashes, and stood in the corners of her mouth, which she held with unchildlike firmness. She went without a word to the fireplace, and stood there with her back to her parents, while occasional drops of water hissed off her raincoat. Then she turned around to face them, and it was the first time Mrs. Delahanty had ever heard adult resignation in her daughter's voice, adult acceptance of the fact that the source of one's joy is also often the source of one's sorrow. I may have forgotten what it's like to be a girl, she thought, but Cress is learning what it's like to be a parent. You have a perfect right to say I told you so now if you want to, Mother, Cress said. You told me I was getting to be a character, and I was, all right. What do you mean, Cress? Her father asked. I mean, I'm character, Cress said bleakly. I'm irresponsible Delahanty. I'm that crazy kid. If I said I was dying, people would laugh. Water ran out of her hair and across her face and dripped off her chin, but she scorned to wipe it away. I made a good speech to the student council, and they laughed at every word I said. They laughed and held their sides and rolled in their chairs like loons. What speech was this, Cress? The speech everybody who's a candidate for an office has to make to them. Then if they like you, they nominate you. I was candidate for freshman editor. What they nominated me for was joke editor. Joke editor? A 2-year-old can be joke editor. All you need to be joke editor is a pair of scissors to cut out jokes with. I wouldn't be joke editor if they shot me for not being. It's a silly job. Take off your coat, Cress, Mrs. Delahanty said, and Cress, not ceasing to speak, began also to unbutton. I would have been a good editor, and I told them the reasons, like I was responsible, knew the meaning of time, would see that the assignments were in on time, and so forth. They laughed like hyenas, she said, not bitterly but reflectively. They said, this is the richest thing yet. Delahanty is a real character. So they nominated me for joke editor, and I'm branded for life. She threw her raincoat, which she had finished unbuttoning, onto the floor and said, I have ruined my life, and walked out of the room, no longer trying to hide the fact that she was crying. Mr. and Mrs. Delahanty still held the positions they had had when Cress entered. Mr. Delahanty, pen above his list. Mrs. Delahanty, nutcracker in one hand, cracked unshelled nut in the other. Mr. Delahanty said, I guess you were right. I guess it would have been better to have forbidden it. I did forbid it, Mrs. Delahanty said, insofar as I could, and you can see what came of that. Mechanically, she picked the kernel from the nut she still held, then got up and threw the pan of shells into the fire. Mr. Delahanty had gone back to his list-making, and she felt almost the first wave of dislike she had ever known for her husband. That was really carrying objectiveness a little too far. Electrification at a time like this. She herself was going to Cress. She looked coldly down at Mr. Delahanty's list as she passed, and saw what had been and was in the process of being written there. Spit, spit, spit Delahanty. Big spit Delahanty. Spit, spit. John saw her look and let her take his hand. I told you it was a dark time, he said quietly. John, you still remember? It still matters? All he said was, you go on into Cress. She's your youngest baby. She let go his hand and went toward Cress's room. She didn't know what she would or could say when she got there. Maybe, Cress, people like you and your father have to try on more than one way of being and doing to see who you are, and you're bound to make mistakes. Maybe she would say, my sweet, sensible daughter, but she would surely hug her and kiss her. Her arms, as she heard through the closed door those catching sobs, already felt that stocky body grow quiet. She opened the door and said, Cress, honey. Chapter 6 13 Winter Part 2 It was the last Thursday in January, about 9 in the evening, cold and raining. The three Delahantys sat close about the living-room fireplace. Mr. Delahanty at the built-in desk, working on his schedule, Mrs. Delahanty on the sofa reading, and between them, crosswise in the wing chair, their daughter. Cress was apparently studying the program of the folk dance festival in which she was to appear the next evening. For the most part, however, she did not even see the program. She saw instead herself, infinitely graceful, moving through the figures of the dance that had been so difficult for her to master. The high school folk dancing class was made up of two kinds of performers: those with natural ability, who had themselves elected the class, and those who, in the language of the physical education department, were remedials. The remedials had been sent into the class willy-nilly in an effort to counteract in them defects ranging from antisocial attitudes to what Miss Ingalls, the gym teacher, called a general lack of grace. Cress had achieved the class under this final classification, but now, at midterm, had so far outgrown it as to be the only remedial with a part in the festival. The first 5 numbers on the program, Tsiganochka, Lady's Whim, Michi Putsti, Hiawatha, and Little Man in a Fix, Cress ignored. It was not only that she was not in these, but they were in no way as beautiful as Road to the Isles, in which Mary Lou Hawkins, Crystal O'Connor, Zelma Mayberry, Bernadine Devers, and Crescent Delahanty took part. The mere sight of her name beside that of Bernadine Devers, Tennant High School's most gifted dancer, most gifted person, really, instantly called up to Cress a vision of herself, featly footing it in laced kirtle and starched skirts. A vision of herself dancing not only the outward steps of Road to the Isles, but its inner meaning, what Miss Ingalls had called the achievement of the impossible. Cress thought that she was particularly adapted to dancing that meaning because she had so recently come that way herself. If she had been given 3 wishes when school opened in September, 2 of them would have been that Bernadine be her friend, and that she herself succeed in the folk dancing class. Both had then seemed equally impossible. Now, not only did she have a part in the festival, but Bernadine was her dear friend, and coming to spend the weekend with her. At the minute the evening reached what she considered its peak of mellowness, she intended to speak to her father and mother about the festival and Bernadine's visit. She was exceedingly uncertain about their performances on both these occasions. The rain suddenly began to fall harder. Cress's father, hearing it on the roof, watched with gratification as the water streamed across the dark window panes. "Just what the oranges have been a-thirsting for," he said. Mrs. Delahanty closed her book. "How's the schedule coming?" she asked her husband. "Okay, I guess," said Mr. Delahanty. Cress looked up from the festival program with embarrassment. The schedule was one of the things she wanted to speak to her father about. She hoped he wouldn't mention it while Bernadine was visiting them. Every winter as work on the ranch slackened, he drew up a schedule for the better ordering of his life, and every spring as work picked up, he abandoned it as easily as if it had never been. Last winter, he had made a plan called A Schedule of Exercises to Ensure Absolute Fitness, which had included not only the schedule of exercises and the hours at which he proposed to practice them, but a list of the weaknesses they were to counteract. He had even gone so far last winter as to put on a pair of peculiar short pants and run 6 times around the orchard without stopping, arms flailing, chest pumping, a very embarrassing sight, and one that Cress could not possibly have explained to Bernadine. This winter, the subject of her father's schedule-making was not in itself so unsuitable. He had bought a new encyclopedia set and was mapping out a reading program that would enable him, by a wise use of his spare time, to cover the entire field of human knowledge in a year. The name of the schedule, written at the top of a sheet of Cress's yellow graph paper, was, in fact, Human Knowledge in a Year. There was nothing about this plan that would call for embarrassing public action, like running around the orchard in shorts, but it was so incredibly naive and dreamy that Cress hoped her father would not speak of it. Bernadine was far too sophisticated for schedules. "Where are you now on your schedule, John?" Mrs. Delahanty asked. Mr. Delahanty, who liked to talk about his plans almost as much as he liked to make them, put down his pen and picked up the sheet of paper on which he had been writing. "I've got all the subjects I want to read up about listed, and the times I'll have free for reading listed. Nothing left to do now but decide what's the best time for what. For instance, if you were me, Gertrude, would you spend the 15 minutes before breakfast on art? Or on archaeology, say?" "You don't ever have 15 minutes before breakfast," Mrs. Delahanty said. Mr. Delahanty picked up his pen. "I thought you wanted to discuss this." "Oh, I do," said Mrs. Delahanty. "Well, if I had 15 minutes before breakfast, I'd read about archaeology." "Why?" asked Mr. Delahanty. "It's more orderly that way," Mrs. Delahanty said. "Orderly?" said Mr. Delahanty. A-R-C, Mrs. Delahanty spelled, comes before A-R-T. Mr. Delahanty made an impatient sound. "I'm not going about this alphabetically, Gertrude. Cut and dried. What I'm thinking about is what would make the most interesting morning reading. The most interesting and inspiring." "Art is supposed to be more inspiring," Mrs. Delahanty told him, "if that's what you're after." This seemed to decide Mr. Delahanty. "No, I think science should be the morning subject," he said, and wrote something at the top of a sheet. "Science," Cress supposed. "That's better," he said. "That leaves art for the evening, when I'll have time to read aloud to you." "Oh, don't change your schedule around for my sake, John," said Mrs. Delahanty, who hated being read to about anything. "I'm not. All personal considerations aside, that's a more logical arrangement. Now the question is, which art?" This seemed to Cress the moment for which she had been waiting. "Dancing is one of the earliest and most important of the arts," she said quickly. "Oh-ho," her father said. "I thought you were in a coma." "I've been rehearsing," said Cress. "Rehearsing?" exclaimed Mr. Delahanty. "In my mind," Cress said. "So that's what was going on. Ladies' whim. Tsiganochka." "Father," Cress interrupted, "I've told you and told you that T is silent. Why don't you take the program and practice the names? I'll help you." Cress got up and took the program across to her father. "Practice them?" said Mr. Delahanty with surprise, reading through the dances listed. "What do I care how they're pronounced?" "Korbushka, Kohanotchka," he said, mispronouncing wildly. "I'm not going to Russia." "But you're going to the folk dance festival," Cress reminded him. "I don't have to go if you don't want—" "I do, Father. You know I want you to go. Only I don't want you to mispronounce the names." "Look, Cress," Mr. Delahanty said, "I promise you I'll keep my mouth shut the whole time I'm there. No one will know you have a father who can't pronounce. Mute I'll come and mute I'll go." "I don't want you to be mute," Cress protested. "And even if I did, you couldn't very well be mute the whole time Bernadine's here. And Bernadine's the star of the program." "To Bernadine," said Mr. Delahanty, referring to the program once again, "I shall speak of Badger and the Lumberman's Two-Step. I can pronounce them fine, and they ought to hold Bernadine. She's not going to be here long, is she?" "Friday to Monday," said Mrs. Delahanty. "In that case," said Mr. Delahanty, "maybe I should find another one. How about the Irish Jollity, Cress? Do I say that all right?" "Now, John," Mrs. Delahanty reproved her husband. "It's all right for him to joke about it to me, Mother, but he mustn't before Bernadine. Bernadine's serious about dancing. She's going to be a great artist." "A great dancer?" Mrs. Delahanty asked. "She hasn't decided what kind of an artist yet," Cress said, "only to be great in something." "Well, well," said Mr. Delahanty, "I'm beginning to look forward to meeting Bernadine." "You already have," Cress told him. "Bernadine was one of the girls who rode with us to the basketball game." Mr. Delahanty squinted his eyes, as if trying to peer backward to the Friday 2 weeks before, when he had provided Cress and 4 of her friends with transportation to an out-of-town game. He shook his head. "Can't recall any Bernadine," he said. "She was the one in the front seat with us," Cress reminded him. "That girl!" exclaimed Mr. Delahanty, remembering. "But her name wasn't Bernadine, was it?" "No," Cress told him. "That's what I wanted to explain to you, because tomorrow's Friday, too." Mr. Delahanty left desk and schedule and walked over in front of the fireplace. From this position, he could get a direct view of his daughter. "What's this you're saying, Cress?" he asked. "Her name isn't Bernadine because tomorrow's Friday? Is that what you said?" "Yes, it is," Cress told him seriously. "Only it's not just tomorrow. Her name isn't Bernadine on any Friday." Mr. Delahanty appealed to his wife. "Do you hear what I hear, Gertrude?" "Mother," Cress protested, "this isn't anything funny. In fact, it's a complete tragedy." "Well, Cress, dear," her mother said reasonably, "I haven't said a word, and your father's just trying to get things straight." "He's trying to be funny about a tragedy," Cress insisted obstinately. "Now, Cress," Mr. Delahanty urged, "you're jumping to conclusions. Though I admit I think it's odd to have a name on Fridays you don't have the rest of the week, and I don't see anything tragic about it." "That's what I'm trying to tell you, only you keep acting as if it's a joke." "What is Bernadine's name on Fridays, Cress?" asked her mother. "Nedra," said Cress solemnly. Mr. Delahanty snapped his fingers. "Yes, sir," he said, "that's it. That's what they called her, all right." "Of course," said Cress. "Everyone does on Fridays, out of respect for her sorrow." "Just what is Bernadine's sorrow, Cress?" her mother asked. "Bernadine never did say out and out, that is. Once in a while she tries to, but she just can't. It overwhelms her. But we all know what, generally speaking, must have happened." "What?" asked Mr. Delahanty, "generally speaking?" Cress looked at her father suspiciously, but his face was all sympathetic concern. "On some Friday in the past," she said, "Nedra had to say no to someone she loved." "How old is Nedra?" Mrs. Delahanty asked. 16, Cress said. "Almost." "Well, it couldn't have been too long ago then, could it?" her mother suggested. "Was this person," Mr. Delahanty ventured, "this person Nedra said no to, a male?" "Of course," said Cress. "I told you it was a complete tragedy, didn't I? His name was Ned. That much we know." "Then the Nedra is in honor of Ned?" asked her mother. "In honor and loving memory," Cress told her. "On the very next Friday, Ned died." Mr. Delahanty said nothing. Mrs. Delahanty said, "Poor boy." "I think he was probably more than a boy," Cress said. "He owned 2 drugstores." After the elder Delahantys had thought about this for a while, Mr. Delahanty asked, "This no, Bernadine, Nedra said, was it to a proposal of marriage?" "We don't ever ask about that," Cress told her father disapprovingly. "It doesn't seem like good taste to us." "No, I don't suppose it is," Mr. Delahanty admitted. "Anyway," Cress said, "that's Bernadine's tragedy, and we all respect it and her wish to be called Nedra on Fridays. And tomorrow is a Friday, and it would be pretty awful to have her upset before the festival." Mr. Delahanty stepped briskly back to his desk. "Don't worry for a second, Cress," he said. "As far as I'm concerned, the girl's name is Nedra." "Thank you, Father," Cress said. "I knew you'd understand. Now I'd better go to bed." At the door to the hallway, she turned and spoke once again. "If I were you, Father, I wouldn't say anything about your schedule to Bernadine." "I hadn't planned on talking to her about it, but what's wrong with it?" Mr. Delahanty sounded a little testy. "Oh, nothing," Cress assured him. "I think it's dear and sweet of you to make schedules. Only," she explained, "it's so idealistic." After Cress left the room, Mr. Delahanty said, "What the hell's wrong with being idealistic?" Cress thought that her friend, in her costume for Fado Blanquita, the Spanish dance in which she performed the solo part, looked like the queen of grace and beauty, and she said so. "This does rather suit my type," Bernadine admitted. She was leaning out from the open casement window of Cress's room into the shimmering, rain-washed air. She tautened her costume's already tight bodice, fluffed up its already bouffant skirt, and extended her hands in one of the appealing gestures of the dance toward the trees of the orange orchard, upon which the window opened. "Is your father a shy man?" she asked. Mr. Delahanty, who had been working near the driveway to the house when the two girls got off the school bus an hour before, had, instead of lingering to greet them, quickly disappeared behind a row of trees. Now in rubber boots, carrying a light spade that he was using to test the depth to which the night before's rain had penetrated the soil, came briefly into sight, waved his spade, and once again disappeared. "No," said Cress, who thought her father rather bold, if anything. "He's just busy, after the rain, you know." "Rain, sunshine, sunshine, rain," Bernadine said understandingly. She moved her hands about in the placid afternoon air, as if scooping up samples. "Farming is an awfully elemental life, I expect." "My father," Bernadine's father, J.M. Devers, was vice president of the Tenant First National Bank. "Probably doesn't know one element from another." "I expect your father's rather an elemental type, too, isn't he? Fundamentally, I mean." "I don't know, Nedra," Cress said humbly. "He's black-haired," Bernadine said. "It's been my experience that black-haired men are very elemental." She brought her expressive hands slowly down to her curving red satin bodice. "You must have a good deal of confidence in your family to let them go tonight," she went on briskly. "Let them?" Cress repeated, amazed at the word. "Perhaps they're different from my family. Mine always keeps me on pins and needles about what they're going to say and do next." "Mine, too," Cress admitted, though loyalty to her father and mother would not permit her to say how greatly they worried her. She never went any place with them that she was not filled with a tremulous concern lest they say or do something that would discredit them all. She stayed with them. She attempted to guide them. She hearkened to every word said to them, so that she could prompt them with the right answers. But let them? "They always just take it for granted that where I go, they go," she said. "There's not much question of letting." "Mine used to be that way," Bernadine confided, "but after what happened at the festival last year, I put my foot down. This year, I told them, you are not going." "What happened last year?" asked Cress, who had not then been a dancer. "After the program was over last year, Miss Ingalls asked for parent participation in the dancing, and my father participated. He danced the hopak, and pretty soon he was lifting Miss Ingalls off the floor at every other jump." "Oh, Nedra," Cress said. "How terrible! What did Ingalls do?" "Nothing," said Bernadine. "That was the disgusting part. As a matter of fact, she seemed to enjoy it. But you can imagine how I suffered." Cress nodded. She could. She was thinking how she would suffer if her father, in addition to mispronouncing all the dances, went out onto the gymnasium floor, and before all her friends, misdanced them. "Are your parents the participating type?" Bernadine asked. Cress nodded with sad conviction. "Father is, and mother is if encouraged." "You'd better warn them right away," Bernadine said. "Your father just came in the back door. You could warn him now." Cress walked slowly down the hallway toward the kitchen. Before the evening was over, her father, too, would probably be jouncing Miss Ingalls around, and even calling Bernadine Bernadine. Then all would be ruined completely. All she had looked forward to for so long. In the kitchen, she noted signs of the special supper her mother was cooking, because of Bernadine. The coleslaw salad had shreds of green peppers and red apples mixed through it tonight to make it festive. The party sherbet glasses, with their long icicle stems, awaiting the lemon pudding. But her mother was out of the kitchen on the back porch telling her father to hurry, because they would have to have dinner early if they were to get to the festival in time. "Festival?" Cress heard her father say. "I wish I'd never heard of that festival. How did Cress ever come to get mixed up in this dancing business anyway?" he asked. "She's no dancer. Why, the poor kid can hardly get through a room without knocking something over, let alone dance." "That's why she's mixed up with it," her mother explained, "to overcome her awkwardness, and she is better." "But is she good enough?" asked her father. "I'd hate to think of her making a spectacle of herself, to say nothing of having to sit and watch it." "Now, John," Cress heard her mother say soothingly, "you're always too concerned about Cress. Will she do this right? Will she do that right? Stop worrying. Cress'll probably be fine." "And maybe fall on her ear, too," her father said morosely. "They oughtn't to put so much responsibility on kids. Performing in public, doesn't it worry you any?" "Certainly it worries me. But all parents worry. And remember, we'll have the star of the performance with us. You can concentrate on Nedra if watching Cress is too much for you." "That Nedra! The only dance I can imagine that girl doing is one in which she would carry somebody's head on a platter." Cress had started back down the hall before her father finished this sentence, but she had not gone so far as to miss its final word. She stopped in the bathroom to have a drink of water, and to see how she looked in the mirror over the wash basin. She looked different. For the first time in her life, she saw herself through other eyes than her own, through her parents' eyes. Did parents worry about the figures their children cut? Were they embarrassed for them, and did they wonder if they were behaving suitably, stylishly, well? Cress felt a vacant, hollow space beneath her heart, which another glass of water did nothing to fill. "Why, I'm all right," Cress thought. "I know how to behave. I'll get by. They're the ones." But she looked at her face again, and it was wavering, doubtful. Not the triumphant face she had imagined, smiling in sureness as she danced the come-and-go figures of Road to the Isles. She went back to her room full of thought. Bernadine was changing her costume, and her muffled voice came from under all her skirts. "Did you tell them?" this muffled voice asked. "No," said Cress, "I didn't." "Why not? Won't you be worried?" "They're the ones who are worrying about me." "About you?" "Father thinks I may fall on my ear." Bernadine, clear of her skirts, nodded in smiling agreement. "It's a possibility that sometimes occurs to me, Cress dear." Cress gazed at her friend speculatively. "They're worried about you, too," she said. "Me?" asked Bernadine, her smile fading. "Father said the only dance he could imagine you doing was one with a head on a platter." "Salome!" Bernadine exclaimed with pleasure. "Your father's imaginative, isn't he? Sympathetically imaginative." "I guess so," Cress said, and in her confusion told everything. "He keeps schedules." "Schedules?" for the better ordering of his life. Bernadine laughed again. How precious, she said. Then, as if remembering, after too long a lapse, the day and her bereavement, she said, Nettie was like that too. Nettie, repeated Cress, pain for the present making Bernadine's past seem not only past, but silly. Oh, shut up about Nettie, Bernadine. Bernadine gave a little gasp. Have you forgotten it's Friday? I don't care what day it is, Cress said. She walked over to her bed, picked up the pillow and lay down. Then she put the pillow over her face. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to Cress Delahanty by Jessamyn West. I'd love to hear from you, so please send me an email to kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.